Welcome to the Resilient Schools podcast on the B Podcast Network. We are so excited to have Alexis Reid on the show today. And we are going to talk about a whole bunch of things, but a lot of executive functioning and building relationships. So Alexis, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're even here? Like, what makes you so amazing that we get to chat with you today?
Thanks, Jethro. I'm so glad to be here. So I am technically an educational therapist and a learning consultant with a specialization primarily in executive function, as you mentioned, social emotional learning, teaching, learning, human development. I do a whole lot of things. As my clients will tell you, Alexis does a little bit of everything. I have another primary focus on designing flexible and accessible learning environments through a universal design for learning lens. I have a private practice here in Boston and in Cape Cod and virtually as I work with people around the world, called Reid Connect LLC, where I help to support individuals and systems, both in person and virtually, kind of at the intersections of learning and well-being. So I'm kind of putting all the pieces together to help people navigate their lives as learners, but it also translates across different aspects and contexts in their life. I am a CAST UDL National Faculty and Cadre member for more than a decade, where I facilitate online and in-person professional development courses and trainings on UDL with a focus on executive function, social emotional learning around the country and around the globe. And I do a lot of more specific executive function workshops and work for myself too. I have a forthcoming book through CAST Publishing coming out on executive function and UDL for insights for educators to better understand how we could proactively plan to support these sets of skills. Myself and my brother, who is a clinical psychologist, Dr. Gerald Reid, are co-hosts on the Reid Connected podcast, which aims to connect and educate curious-minded individuals with information relative to mental health, learning, performance, education, wellness, executive function, and so much more. Lots of different things, and I'm very passionate about my work, and I'm grateful on so many levels to be able to do what I do.
Yeah, and as we talked about when I met you in person a couple weeks ago, it's pretty cool that you get to design what your work life looks like and the things that you do. What do you think people should get out of this episode that we talk about today?
Ooh, great question. I think if we were to boil it down to a couple ideas, it would be to understand that variability exists across all learning environments, across all learners and humans in general, that we need to accept that everybody is going to think, learn, and engage a little bit differently, and we can be considerate of how some of them will have different skill sets that maybe need to be developed with our focus on executive function here today, and that we can empathize and support them in that process. But most importantly, that the relationships that we have with learners that we interact with and we have the privilege of working with really, I think, transcends anything we could try to explicitly teach them.
Yeah. I was going to add to that piece about the relationship transcending things. And I feel so strongly that if we can see each person as their own unique individual, then we're going to be set up so much better for success in all areas of our life, and that they're going to have more success as well. So I think that's the big thing to get out of this is, as you're listening, where are you succeeding in that regard, and where could you use a little bit of extra effort to help you be more successful in that regard? And more importantly, we didn't talk about this per se, but what do you need to take off your plate and stop worrying about that is preventing you from connecting and being with people? I guess we talked about it right at the very end of the show. And we need, listen to the end for that key little tidbit. Okay, we will get to our interview here with Alexis in just a moment. Thanks so much for listening to Resilient Schools on the B Podcast Network. So, Alexis, tell us about how students are wounded by school. What does that mean, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so There's a really great book by Kirsten Olson, which I recommend all educators read, which is called Wounded by School. And, in my work as an educational therapist, I often am interacting with learners of all ages who share their story with me. And I feel like I have a really unique privilege that I have their trust enough for them to share their experiences with me. And what their own school wounds might look like can be different depending on a lot of different situations. Typically, the primary population of learners that I work with usually have some sort of diagnosis of ADHD or ADD, a learning disability. They've experienced mental health challenges and it's impacted their executive function skills. So that's primarily the work that I focus on. So when they come to me, a lot of the different stories they tell are related to, other adults in their lives, whether it's an educator, parent, or staff member who's like, how could you be so bright and so capable, but then struggle so much, right? A lot of invalidation around their experience of maybe not being able to access the curriculum or the content, struggling socially in different situations where maybe they can't read nonverbals or they have a hard time with their working memory skills holding on to information to be able to share back at an appropriate time in an appropriate way. Sometimes it's as what we might say like simple as that, even though those experiences can be really heavy for a lot of people given their circumstance and whatever they might have experienced in the past. And other times it can really feel traumatic to them. And I use that word purposefully, but I also want to say it with caution that, trauma is something that is a very specific experience that has long lasting impact. But, sometimes there are educators who interact with students in a way that could feel traumatic to a learner. So, what those school wounds look like can be different for each individual, but really it's the story of what a child or a learner's experience is and how they do or do not feel capable or engaged in a way that feels meaningful to them. So a lot of times, I bet every one of your listeners, and Jethro, I know you and I have talked about this already, that we've all had encounters with learners who just feel disconnected, disengaged, really kind of feel like they don't have the capabilities or they're just feeling totally isolated in their experience in school, which can feel like they don't belong. They feel like school isn't for them. So when we think about these school wounds, it could be a number of different things. But from my experience and the anecdotes that I could share and we'll probably talk about here in our time together are really based on, students who were struggling, who were trying to pull it together, trying to hold on to what they needed to do, trying their best to show up and do what they can, and often were under recognized, like the struggle wasn't noticed or addressed, or that they asked for support and never really got what they needed because maybe it was difficult for them to articulate in those moments when it was hard for them, or those who would act out in some, as we call in the educational world, behavioral way. And, that was a symptom of something else that was going on for them that got misinterpreted and they just got in trouble a lot instead of really getting their needs met in different ways. So, these school wounds, I think, all go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like, what do we need at different levels and stages of our life? And how do we access those things to feel comfortable and safe, which is ultimately the goal of being in school and in learning, is to feel safe and comfortable, welcome and supported, to be able to explore, create, make mistakes, and just kind of learn through that process.
You said a couple things that I want to go back and focus on. The first one is that there are kids who feel like school is not for them. And the harsh reality that we don't like to admit, but that I think we must admit, is that school is not designed to be beneficial to kids. And it is not designed for the learners. It is designed for the adults in the building. Do you want to comment on that? I have my own thoughts, but I'd love to hear what you think first.
Wow. That's a powerful statement. Whoa. Um, okay. School is not designed. If you go all the way back to the history of education, as we can go back to the history of education in America, we'll start with, right? It was very industrialized. It's very focused on, how do we help students to be able to meet the needs of the job needs, right? The industrial economic needs of the country versus how do we inspire children and learners to be excited about learning new things. So yeah, in that respect, school isn't necessarily established and designed in a way to spark creativity and learning and the creation of knowledge, helping and problem solving. So, there is a lot of these historical foundations for education, as we all know, that are rooted in like, how do we help people to do the thing that society wants you to do versus explore what works best for you. And, in a world where standardization makes things easier to do, it makes sense for educators to kind of go through the process of doing what is going to hopefully help capture the attention and the intellect of the majority versus really looking at the broad spectrum of variability in learning. And my background, as you and I have discussed before, is really focused on educational and developmental psychology with a focus on universal design for learning, where my whole world is about looking at variability in learning and in life, right? Like I can't actually turn that lens off once I put those glasses on to be able to understand that there's so much variability. We can't just like aim for the middle, as most educational institutions have pretty much been designed and have been functioning to do for so long. So it's, I want to validate the educators who might be in the system where they're like following their curriculum and doing what they need to and getting through their content, but also really like make light of the point you're making that the systems aren't really set up to inspire true knowledge building, critical problem solving, and learning for the learner, at least the majority in the United States. And to tell you the truth, I think a lot of different schools, at least those I've worked with, they're forward thinking and wanting to take a more universal designed approach to learning. But, there are a lot of antiquated systems that fall back on what's comfortable and what they know versus maybe what the students and learners really need.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of that, and I'm much more aggressive in my condemnation of our system because I think that we're doing such a disservice and doing so much that is like learning is not our goal in schools. Compliance is our goal. So we're not interested in kids learning. We are interested in them being compliant and doing what we ask them to do. And the problem that I see with this is that when that happens, that's where these wounds come from, is that we have a goal that is different from what we claim our goal is. Like, lots of schools have mission statements that say like, we want to empower our kids to do these different things, and the reality is that they don't actually want to do that, which is why there's always such cognitive dissonance around that, is that they may say this is what we want and that we're focused on learners, but then all the decisions are made are focused on the making things easier for the adults. I mean, grades is a good example of that. Just the idea that we even have grades, standards at different levels are good examples of that as well. So the reason why I bring that up first is because I want to move into this idea of executive functioning. And to make sure that everybody understands, can you define briefly what executive functioning means so that we know we're talking about the same thing?
Yeah, for sure. So essentially, executive function is such an elusive term because it's been defined in so many different ways, especially in education. It's kind of been boiled down to the behaviors related to the cognitive set of skills that essentially allow for us to get things done, right? If I talk about executive function, it's like this is a set of cognitive skills that are employed across development and across our lives to be able to get things done, especially efficiently, is really the goal. That's the umbrella way of describing it in simple terms. But really, Executive function from a more of a neurocognitive sense is looking at three core cognitive skills. So we've got inhibition, our ability to be able to pause and assess before responding and reacting. We've got working memory, so being able to take in information and then do something with it. So this is not necessarily short or long-term memory. It's more of like actually working memory. So if I'm going to give you a direction, you're able to take that direction and do something with it and act on it. And then finally, we have cognitive flexibility, where we're able to like shift sets. So if we're given one direction and then all of a sudden a new direction is added or a new plan needs to be followed, that we have that flexibility to be able to make a pivot, to be able to shift our approach. So there's tons of research out there on executive function, and I use those three core cognitive skills to define what it is, because there's been an amalgamation of all these great research studies and articles and all of the things about executive function that have been boiled down primarily through Adele Diamond and Joseph Nigg, who have done some really great work to boil it down to those three core skills. So when I and most people nowadays are talking about executive function, those are the core cognitive skills that we're talking about. And then, we have the behaviors related to it. How do we plan? How do we organize? How do we prioritize? A lot of people talk about time management. I don't really think we could manage time, so I talk about it in terms of how do we prioritize time, task initiation, progress monitoring, a whole slew of skills and related behaviors that we want students to be able to carry out and do. And to be quite honest, it's not just about learning. Executive function skills are a part of everybody's daily life, whether you're taking care of a household, working at a business, or, even just, working at a market, being able to like organize your whole process in way in which you're interacting with people, the way in which you're setting up your day and doing the things you need to do. So there are so many different related behaviors to executive function, and I get all lit up, as you could probably tell, talking about it, because when I think about learning and education, like, this is a set of skills that every single person needs to be able to embody, to practice, to develop, to refine, to be able to do things in their lives, period. It's not just a certain segment of individuals who maybe need some extra support. It's not just a certain socioeconomic class. It's not just a certain cultural group. These are skills across the board that everyone around the world can develop and build and strengthen. Though we do know through a universal design approach, everybody benefits from developing these skills, but there are certain more vulnerable populations of individuals and learners who definitely need additional supports to be able to strengthen and bolster those skills, especially those who have a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD. Executive function doesn't fall in the United States in the DSM as a specific diagnosis, but it is closely tied to attention deficit. And a lot of people, Dr. Barkley in particular, who will say that ADHD is more of an executive function deficit versus an attention deficit. But this is an area that often gets impacted by those individuals, for those individuals, and also individuals who have learning disabilities, those who are on the autism spectrum, those who have experienced trauma or have mental health challenges, as well as those who have had, traumatic brain injury. Oftentimes we see a reduction in executive function skills. So there's a lot of different individuals who absolutely need additional support in developing these skills, but everybody benefits from it. And I always say that the best part about my job and my work is that these are skills that can be developed. It's not like you have what you have and that's it. There's always ways to become a better problem solver, to learn how to inhibit differently, to practice different skills. And we see this in, young kids playing games and interacting with each other. We could see these skills develop and come online in so many different ways, which is really cool.
So I like how you said that it's not just about learning, but about living also. I think we could do a whole podcast about how you can't manage time, you can only prioritize it. So That will be podcast number 2 with you and me. I think we should go into that deeply at a later time.
Mm-hmm.
But then the other thing that I want to think about with this is, because we can define it as inhibition, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, we can see how if that were our goal, to help kids in school have good executive functioning, we would have to change how we do school. Now, the thing that we've already been talking about is being wounded by schools in those situations. So how do these wounds come about as it relates to these core tenets of executive functioning? What are some of the things that you see there? And let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So for one, the invalidation, right? I think that is probably one of the biggest things that I hear from people that I work with and I've worked with over the years is that, they often get mislabeled as behavioral issues, or, they will call themselves dumb or stupid or just not able to do things because they struggle with being able to activate these skills. And oftentimes these are learners who can have really deep, sophisticated conversations because oftentimes their verbal skills are pretty strong and they can communicate, or they have different strengths that they use to compensate and kind of hide their skill deficits that are still developing. So it could be easy for an adult in their world to say, well, why can't you do this? You were able to do that before, and why is this one task so challenging for you? So the invalidation part and just this misinterpretation of their struggles is often a big part of those school wounds.
Yeah. I didn't prep you for this specifically, but this invalidation is tying in very nicely to this idea of school is not designed for kids. That if a student cannot do addition or read by a certain age or grade level or whatever, then they are quote unquote dumb, even if nobody ever says that. Even if everybody is like supportive and helpful and all that, they still feel dumb because they know what kids are expected to do at that certain time, and they know that they don't fit that mold. And so there's this balance that you have to have between saying this is what we're doing and this is where we want to go, and having kids like be okay with realizing that not everybody moves at the same rate or in the same way. And that is literally the truth. We are all unique individuals, and we have to start there. But our school system does not set us up for that. Our school system says that we all need to move in the same way at the same rate and learn the things in the same order, and that's just not the reality. So I have this image that I created. You've probably seen the what success looks like, or what people think success looks like, and what success actually looks like. Well, I did a little twist on that, and it is what schools think learning looks like, and what learning actually looks like. And it is really just this crazy mess of like different kinds of strings all mixed together and all jumbled, and like it doesn't work. And there's one through line that is the actual learning, but there are so many things interconnected and related to it that you can't possibly say this specific teacher taught this specific skill at this specific time and it was this beautiful straight line, because a student may have learned something from this other experience that had nothing to do with it, and that's how they solidified that learning, that it is impossible to replicate, it's impossible to duplicate. But if it doesn't happen within the four walls of the classroom, then it doesn't count, or it's not valid, or whatever, and that leads kids to thinking that they're dumb. And so I love that term of invalidation, because it's basically saying these other things don't count. All that counts is what's in the four walls of our classroom, and that's the only learning that matters. And how do we overcome that as educators and make it so that all kids feel like all their learning is valued and is worthwhile, etc. Go ahead. You've got a big smile on your face, so I know you've got the answer, which I'm excited to hear. You're going to solve our problems.
Well, I'm laughing because there is no. I wish there was one answer, and it was that
Yeah.
prescriptive. I joke all the time that even in my work to build executive function skills, it's so nuanced. There's like a million strategies and skills that I can offer to help specifically target those skills, but it doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone all the time. So everything's so nuanced. But when we think about when we get metrics involved in education, it's a really good way to help us understand trends and patterns in quote unquote learning. But it goes back to like what Einstein said, right? If you're going to judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll live its whole life believing it's stupid. And we use that a lot in the UDL world because it's like our assessments for what learning looks like, it doesn't necessarily capture true learning. And I have to explain this all the time to especially parents that a lot of these assessments are more for educators to see how well they did at teaching the skills that they taught. But it really is just a snapshot. It doesn't necessarily capture how a learner is doing more than how they showed up that day and they navigated through a set of questions that they were given in any other way. And one of the things that I don't often lead with, but maybe I should, is that I'm a Montessorian at heart. I was actually, I feel very lucky that my parents sent me to a Montessori preschool when I was younger. And that is pretty much how I was raised at home with my family, is that like I was very creative and exploratory, communicative, as you could probably imagine. And I really loved to like dive deep into things that I cared a lot about. And it's set me on this path to be, I think, the truest version of myself, to find my purpose through these experiences. And, later in life, after I went to graduate school for applied developmental and educational psychology, I learned about UDL. I started doing teacher trainings around UDL. And then I actually went back and became a trained Montessori teacher, which I want to share for a moment, because I think this targets a little bit of what you're asking, where I don't think there's one best fit for every single student all the time, but there are some core things we could do as educators to be able to help them feel safe, secure, connected, as you were asking. But from a Montessori pedagogical philosophy, I'll just share a quick tidbit, is that we want to be sure that we're setting up some firm parameters to allow for flexibility. And this is actually a core principle in the universal design for learning world too, is that when we have firm goals, we can allow for flexibility in how we achieve and reach those goals. So in a Montessori classroom, she talks about order and chaos, right? The environment becomes another teacher rather than it just being a reliance on an adult or even a mentor. And then peer interactions become another teacher. The materials that the students are using to learn becomes another teacher. We need to actually like take our ego out of the picture as educators and realize that we are not like the sole holders of all the knowledge and wisdom that these students are going to be able to attain in their time that they have with us. And the reality is like, the learners I work with have greater insight than I can ever imagine sometimes, but they haven't had the opportunity to really share that or explore it or to interact or like get messy with it. So I think one of the most important things that we can do is really give students and learners that structure with flexibility for one, and also like really giving them an opportunity to share their voice. When they're able to take time to reflect. A good majority of my work one-on-one with individuals or in groups, and I hear this from students of all ages that I work with, when I say, what's the biggest benefit of us working together? And they say, it gives me time to press pause and to reflect back on how things have been going, and then think about what else I can do differently. And I think when we go into the classroom, I wish that we'd be able to give a little bit more opportunity to do that. And I know I hear every educator saying, well, we don't have time to do that, blah, blah, blah. Yes, and if we don't take the time to do that, what are we actually teaching? That it's just about task completion and compliance? Or are we really getting into like, how do we think well? How do we learn and explore and create and problem solve, because that's really what the world needs these days. There's, with AI and all of the computer systems and digital technologies, like, there's an app for that. But there's not necessarily this like human aspect of how do we interact and collaborate and problem solve and understand empathy to support each other and big problems in our world to be able to do better. And that's really what learning is about. So if I were to say like two of the biggest things that we could do, and there's plenty more, this is like 5 other podcasts that we could have together, but I think two of the primary things is to really set up structure with flexibility and allow for student voice to feel respected, to feel heard, to feel appreciated. I think we all in this world, this is not me just talking about students in a classroom, but I think all of us in humanity need to do better at listening and sharing our experiences and valuing and feeling safe in doing that, even if we have differences in perspective and experience, to be able to talk with one another, to be able to really truly understand and going back to that word, to validate that, yeah, that makes sense because you lived it, versus that doesn't make sense because it's not what I asked you to do.
That's powerful. So I love that idea. Just a quick side note about the AI stuff. And you said something so important in school, really about task completion. And that is how we have set it up to be. So a lot of teachers are upset that kids are using artificial intelligence to complete their tasks. But that's exactly how we've set it up, so that that's what their goal is to complete the task. And so that I've been speaking about AI a lot lately, and that's one of the things that I've been harping on again and again, that if we use AI to circumvent the learning process, and we set it up that way from the beginning as the teachers, that kids can do that, then we're in a world of hurt. If we, however, set it up so that the learning process is the focus, and then it doesn't really matter if they use AI, because if the AI helps them with the learning process, that's great. That's what we want. If the AI is circumventing the learning process, we're going to see and know and be able to tell very quickly that that's what's going on. And then we can continue that conversation about the AI circumventing the learning process. That's not what we're looking for. So that side piece, I think, is really valuable and important to just talk about briefly. And on the Transformative Principal podcast, if you listen to this show but don't listen to that show, my interview with Victor Karkar, we talk about that a lot, as he is creating an AI app to help. Teachers definitely want to use AI to complete their tasks, as well they should. And the real important thing is that once you have a skill, you should be using technology and tools to make that skill go faster. And for example, once you know how to do addition and multiplication, then it makes sense to use a calculator, because you can do it so much quicker and you can tell if it's correct or not. So as a side point, next question on this topic. Okay, hit it.
Well, I'm going to talk about that for 1 second. And this, again, could be a whole nother hour conversation or more, but I just want to say, I have mixed feelings about AI, and I will speak from the educators that are resistant and hesitant, that they might say, oh, this is scary, I don't understand it, but there are so many things that we didn't understand before that actually are so ingrained in a part of our lives these days. I mean, you and I right now are on different sides of the country and communicating and recording and sharing information, which 10 years ago we would have thought was futuristic and, Jetsonian, I'll call it, from the Jetsons.
I do have to interrupt you for just a second, because I have been doing my podcast for 10 years and done them all virtually. So we need to go back a little bit further. Yeah.
So for me, 10 years ago.
I just, it is pretty amazing that these tools even exist. I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah. But for the, what you were saying makes a lot of sense, that, especially as educators, because there's so many hats, there's so many tasks, there's so many things that need to happen, and there's so many teachers and educators that I think have really been benefiting, even researchers and psychologists as well. who have been really benefiting from, some AI generated systems that we might not even realize, help in grading and navigating things. But I think it all comes down to this really important behavior related to executive function skills is prioritization. How do we prioritize the skills, the tasks, the work that's getting done? And sometimes we need to offload some of the menial tasks that have those skills have already been established. Like you said, I love the example of the calculator. Like once we have our arithmetic skills developed, which by the way, those increase our working memory, holding on to information, manipulating it, and sharing a response. It's a really great way to practice, especially through games. But once you have those skills established and solidified, using a calculator makes sense. There are very few adults who don't pull out their calculator and just double check something. So why are we asking young learners to do that? I mean, it's almost like an I gotcha. Like, you don't have that skill yet? I gotcha. Versus hey, how do we build efficiencies to do this a little bit better? And the one thing with AI that I think is helpful from an executive function perspective too is sometimes the individuals who really haven't developed EF skills yet really need an extra boost sometimes to get started. So building clarity in the way in which directions and prompts are delivered, boiling things down into more simplistic terms or steps. When AI helps with that, it could transform a student's experience, and it moves from them procrastinating, avoiding, not doing work to sometimes just getting started. And again, I always say, it's either going to help you or it's not going to help you. And if you're going to use it as something that you're going to just produce something from it, it's not actually benefiting you because you're not learning and you're not necessarily building your skills. But if it's going to help you to get started, if it's that initial entry point, sometimes that's what students need. And sometimes, and this is a big point that I hope we come back to too, students have a hard time admitting because they are embarrassed, because they feel shame, because they feel guilt, because they feel like I should be able to do this, that they don't even know how to ask for help. And this is where we see a lot of these school wounds come up and bubble up to the surface when there's those experiences. So again, I am skeptical of AI. I think that human relationships are more important than most anything, and we'll talk more about that too in a minute. But I think there's some really nice potential for some of these technologies that I've seen in the AT world with some of my colleagues and friends who do incredible work to help individuals with disabilities really gain access to learning and different life skills.
AT world being assistive technology world, I presume, right? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
I'm glad that you went there because that's where I was going to segue after this conversation anyway, because I do think it ties into artificial intelligence, that the other part of artificial intelligence is that if it circumvents something, then it is also, in my mind, bad. And that is that if it circumvents relationships, that we should use artificial intelligence also to help improve our relationships. And like you said, so we don't have to talk about AI anymore, but let's talk about relationships and how important that is, how that helps heal wounds, and how it helps us grow closer to others and be more connected with them.
Yeah, so something you said earlier reminded me of one of those stories in Kirsten Olsen's book about school wounds, and it was by Todd Rose, who, when I was doing my internship at CAST back in grad school, probably 17 years ago or so, I got to work with him and got to know him. He's an incredible individual. He's got some great YouTube videos and amazing books out there, one of which is called Square Peg. And one of the things he shares and a lot of the stories that he tells in his work, he's now a professor at Harvard and does some really incredible work in a collaborative that he recently started. He tells a story about how he was an ADHD kid who often would get in a lot of trouble when he was younger. In fact, he ended up dropping out of high school and ended up in a very different situation than you would expect most Harvard trained neuroscientists with their PhD. So he tells this story, and Square Peg is all about these learners who oftentimes are these square pegs trying to be fit into these round holes. And I'll spare you all the details, but I really want you to think about that image, that when we set up learning environments in classrooms and educational institutions where we have these expectations that not everybody could meet, what is that actually devaluing in the process of teaching, learning, and education? I think it's devaluing variability. It's devaluating creative thought. It's devaluating problem solving, which are essential skills that, for many years, the United States educational system was known for, right? Because it was supposedly a place that was different from, some of the Asian schools and some of the other schools overseas, where things were very much about metrics and statistics and what the outcome was. So even though we have fault with some of the educational school systems here in the US, around the world, we were kind of known for a place where there was more creativity, especially in some of the more progressive schools that we have in the States. Not necessarily all of the public schools, though there are some incredible schools doing really great work that I feel fortunate to be able to work with and have worked with in the past. So I want us to think about this idea of when we set up these boundaries, like I said, are actually very important. But if we don't allow for flexibility, what happens? The learners often will kind of sink, you could see them physically sinking into their seat. They'll push back against the boundaries. They'll disengage. Oftentimes, you'll see them just not show up anymore, even physically. We have a big issue, I think, in the States, especially with school refusal, getting students even to come to the classroom for various reasons. And I can't tell you how many times, and this is not a knock on teachers, but I can't tell you how many times a lot of students are like, my teacher is just somebody I can't talk to. I don't feel like I have a relationship with. I don't feel like they understand me as a learner. They just keep pushing and pushing and pushing instead of really understanding, and it totally shuts them down. And these are really bright, curious kids. And I've said on my podcast with my brother that, I've never met a student who doesn't want to do well. And he pushed back and said, well, that's not always the case, because sometimes their goal is to not do well and they don't feel comfortable doing well for other psychological reasons. So I'll leave that right there. But but for the majority of students over my 20 plus years in education that I've worked with, I've never met a student who didn't want to learn and improve, right? They often didn't know how to articulate it. They often didn't know how to do it. They often didn't even know what was getting in their way. But as much as possible, and of course, I too probably have made many mistakes in my career, to not be able to fully address everything for everyone, because that's a really difficult thing to do when you have a lot of students you work with. But I try my best to be curious, right? Ask good questions, to be able to say like, hey, was this helpful or was this not helpful? What do you think might be helpful? What do you think won't be helpful? What do you think we could do differently? And help to like engage this critical thinking system to be able to start problem solving, right? It starts with validation, as we mentioned, but I think it also moves into, can we problem solve together? Because when we think about these young learners or those who have more vulnerable sets of executive function skills, it makes it really difficult for them to problem solve by themselves, right? What are the options? Sometimes they don't even know there are other options, because they're like, this adult teacher who is in charge of me right now told me that this is how things have to be done, and I can't do that, right? And this is where these school wounds come up again. It's like, I can't do that, so there's something wrong with me, versus, is there maybe another approach I should be taking?
It, it sounds like I need to get your brother on the show also and talk about that thing about kids, some kids not wanting to do well. And the reality is everybody wants to do well, however they define doing well. They may not want to do well within the context of what school defines as well, but everybody wants to have a fulfilling life. Everybody wants to live a life at their best, and I truly believe deep down that everybody is doing the best they possibly can in that moment, even if it's not as good as they were 5 minutes ago, or as good as they will be 5 minutes from now. In that moment, you're constantly doing the best that you possibly can, because if you could do any better, you already would be. And just having that perspective with anybody we interact with, it really opens up a lot of understanding and empathy and caring about them as human beings that I think is really powerful, and we don't spend enough time recognizing or validating or valuing that. Alexis, this has been a great conversation. I could, we found 7 different ideas that we could do for other shows. So we're going to be in touch a lot. And I just want to say, as we close out here, thank you to you as well for making time for me when I was in Boston a couple weeks ago to be able to see you. I mean, we only spoke for like 20 minutes while we were eating lunch. And I just appreciated you making that effort so much. You were busy, and it was not the best possible situation, but it was the best we could do in the moment. And it was so wonderful to meet you in person. And as I've said in my newsletter and other things, whenever I connect with someone, I expect that relationship to last for 10 years. And that is the truth. And I think we got a great 10 years ahead of us. So I'm thankful for you and this opportunity to be here with you today. So thank you.
That's very sweet. And thank you for having me on the show. And in fact, I think that example is probably the best advice for educators listening, or, administrators listening into the podcast. It's like, even when you're busy, even when there's a lot going on, even when there's not that much time, you can make time to make that connection and just to check in and just say, hey, you matter to me, and I want to make sure that I show up for you. And I think that is probably one of the most powerful things we could do in education, but in life. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I appreciate you, and thank you for all you do for the educators out there and for having me on. Hopefully this won't be the last time.
No way. Last thing, you definitely put your money where your mouth is, because you did that. So just saying, that's awesome. And if people want to reach out to you, the best place is probably reidconnect.com, which is your website. Would you like to promote or suggest people go anywhere else?
Yeah, so I'm also on Instagram at Alexis ANN Reid, REID, and on X, Twitter, whatever we call it nowadays. And also, my brother and I have a podcast also called the Reid Connect Ed podcast, which is really about connecting people to information about wellness, mental health, education, executive function, and really just about how to navigate this complicated life of ours.
Thank you so much. This has been great chatting with you, and look forward to the future. If you like what you heard, there are 3 ways that you can get more from it. First, share the podcast with your friends and talk about it with them as well. Second, go to resilientschools.com and download the roles in a Resilient Schools cheat sheet. Third, reach out to us if you need training around any of the topics on this podcast by going to resilientschools.com.